Hi everyone, I'm Manisha, the president of the Mobile Clinic Club, and I'm going to do a little introduction where I'll be presenting our presenters and who will basically be talking to you a bit about vaccinations and the purpose of vaccinations and their benefits. So I'm just going to begin with introducing Carl McGovern, who is an MD1 student. And then we have Dunia Altrabulsi, who is also an MD Year 2 student. Okay, and then we have Hamreet Baidwan and Bernice, who are both from the CS year in the MBBS course. We will also be having Professor Karayiannis joining us, who has been an advisor through the process of this presentation. So I just want to also let you know that at the end of this session, we'll be having a Q&A session where you guys can ask your questions and the presenters will be able to answer them. Okay, and now I think we'll just begin.
Hello, everybody. Today, my colleagues and I will be talking to you about World Immunization Week and how vaccines bring us closer. First off, we'll start by saying what exactly is immunization. It's the process of becoming protected against a disease by vaccination. Vaccines come in various forms, including injections or shots, liquids, or nasal sprays. Vaccines teach your body to recognize and fight harmful germs and teach your body to defend against them, basically. There are many different types of vaccines available, and we will discuss them later on. Currently, there are vaccines available for more than 20 harmful diseases. Now let's go a little bit back to the past, where it all started in 1796, when Edward Jenner developed the first successful vaccine against smallpox. Smallpox was a contagious disease caused by the variola virus. At best, it left people with permanent severe scars. At worst, it was deadly. Thankfully, using vaccinations, smallpox has now been eradicated worldwide, and nowadays no one receives the smallpox vaccination anymore. Another great example of the importance of immunization worldwide is the MMR vaccine. MMR stands for measles, mumps, and rubella, which are 3 viral diseases with serious complications. Measles patients present with red pinpoint rash all over their body. One of its complications can be pneumonia or even brain damage. Mumps is characterized by swelling the gland below the ear. Before the vaccine was introduced, it was the most common cause of meningitis and acquired deafness. Rubella symptoms include both red rash and swelling below the ear, and it's particularly dangerous to pregnant women. Now, you may ask yourself, why do we care about all of this? Well, as we said before, the aim of vaccinations is to help our bodies build a defense system against particular diseases, which will reduce our risk of infection. This is crucial in prevention of spread of infectious diseases and controlling outbreaks if they do happen. Vaccines are a global responsibility for the benefit of us as individuals and for the protection of those around us. How does that happen? Well, that can be explained by the concept of herd immunity. Herd immunity states that basically if a certain percentage of people are vaccinated against a certain disease, then the chances of that disease spreading in the community are much lower. Obviously, more infectious diseases that are more easily spread require a higher percentage to reach herd immunity. But nonetheless, this is very important for people who cannot receive vaccinations, like immunocompromised patients, people with certain allergies, or even newborn babies against a certain age, below a certain age, sorry.
Okay, and I'll be talking a bit about COVID. So let's take a step back and analyze the situation. This is unfortunately a global pandemic and has resulted in about 184 awaiting clinical statuses vaccines, 88 in clinical development, and only so many developed. Now, the ones we're going to look at right now are Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and the Sputnik variants of the vaccines. But first, before I discuss these, I will talk a little bit about what they're made of. And we have 4 different types. So whole virus, which uses a weakened, attenuated, or deactivated form of the pathogen, and this causes the disease to trigger a protective immunity against it. So when we talk about live attenuated, we mean weakened. When we talk about inactivated virus, it's when the genetic material is destroyed. Then we have nucleic acid viruses and vaccines, which basically allow us to use genetic material from directly the disease-causing virus, bacterium, or pathogen, in this case, virus, to stimulate an immune response against it. So we talk about DNA and RNA variants, in this case, against COVID, RNA. Then we have more modern ones. So 2 of them would be the viral vectors. Now, these are a little bit different because they actually don't contain antigens specifically. Rather, very similar to a virus, they use the body's own cells to produce them. Thus, by doing this, they deliver the material directly into the human cell, in this case with COVID, the COVID-19 spike proteins. And lastly, a little bit, how shall we say this, far-reached science in this case would be protein subunits. Now, these are very interesting, and one of the examples for that is the Sinovac vaccine that's coming out. And rather than injecting a whole pathogen to trigger an immune response, they're actually known as subunit vaccines or acellular vaccines, which contain purified pieces specially selected for their ability to stimulate immune cells. Now, to give you a few examples, Pfizer and Moderna both share RNA nucleic acid methods of administration, and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson are basically viral vectors. Now, let's talk a little bit about the pandemic itself. So here's a table showing you a few general comparisons. Obviously, China and Russia don't necessarily release a lot of data, so that's what we have so far. So about the pandemic. At this point, we simply cannot produce long-term prognosis. There have been too many mutations, too many subvariants, too many variants themselves, and the prognosis is just not clear. At the moment in Cyprus, however, we can be clear of this. 220,000 vaccinations have been already administered, with a scheduled 57,000. And the whole point of this, the whole tactic, is to reduce the extension in hotels and reduce the strain on the A&E system, which, as we know, is under tremendous strain at the moment. And I'll talk a little bit about side effects. Now, as just everyone who's watched the news recently knows, there has been a lot of talk about the effect known as thrombosis or blood clotting. Now, to reassure everyone here, it's been blown out of proportion. It's 4 in a million, very rare indeed. Uncommon side effects, on the other hand, include very typical ones. We're talking about mild pain upon the ejection site. And common ones include low-grade pyrexia, fatigue, myalgia, headaches, and even exhilarating lymphedema or swelling. And finally, I'll talk a little about the efficacy rates. So the key argument here is this discussion about 80 to 95%. We want to be reducing the burdens on hospitals and A&E sectors down, because at this point, we are reaching a critical time in which they may actually be overwhelmed, and that is not good for anyone on this island. And we are not looking at total eradication. Rather, at this point, we're looking at trying to reduce what is essentially a giant wave of cases. And the one thing I will have to say, and this is shout out to Brain Gang and Dr. Georgios Siakalis for this information, we've actually only had 1 death in Cyprus, and the clinical picture in that particular case was extremely poor to begin with. So the key feedback here is protection, reduced hospitalizations, and decreasing those R numbers and those incidence cases down.
However, people in the population still remain hesitant to receive vaccinations as they fear immunization. These fears can arise due to many underlying misconceptions about vaccine. These include fears that arise from practical concerns. For example, concerns about the modern vaccine schedule, which requires children to receive up to 24 shots before the age of 2. Or they may arise from scientific or moral misgivings. in the case of like the MMR vaccine. The fears of immunization have resulted in a growing anti-vaccination and vaccine hesitancy movements globally, and these movements have resulted in various outbreaks. There's a lot of misinformation and misconception about vaccines that contribute to this growing problem. So it's important that we acknowledge the facts behind some of these common vaccine myths. So one myth is that vaccines are not safe. Licensing of vaccines actually require exhaustive evaluation and testing to make sure that they are safe and effective. Every batch of vaccine is controlled separately and follows pre-qualifications and licensing set out by the World Health Organization. And if any serious side effect does arise, it is thoroughly investigated. Another myth is that vaccines cause autism. There is no evidence that links measles, mumps, rubella to autism or autistic disorders. There was a 1998 study which raised concerns about the possible link between these two, but the paper has been retracted by the journal that it was published in, and the author was found guilty of serious professional misconduct, and he no longer can practice medicine in the United Kingdom. Another myth is that it is better to be immunized through disease than through vaccines. In actuality, the immune response to vaccines is similar to the one that's produced by natural infection. Vaccines allow you to actually build immunity without the damaging effects that come from acquiring the disease naturally, such as if you get Haemophilus influenza type B, it can cause intellectual disability. If you get hepatitis, it can lead to liver cancer. And all of this can be prevented by receiving the vaccine. Another myth is that vaccine preventable diseases are almost eradicated in my country, so there is no reason to uphold and increase investment in immunization. Vaccines maybe have become uncommon in your country, but they still exist worldwide. Immunization coverage is not 100%, and in recent years, there have been outbreaks in high immunizable coverage countries, such as the United States had a measles outbreak recently. And this goes back to the concept of herd immunity. If enough people are vaccinated, the chances of that disease spreading are much lower. And if the proportion of the population that's vaccinated is lower, then the chance of the disease spreading is higher. And also getting vaccinated is like wearing a mask. So it isn't just about protecting yourself, but protecting others, such as like the immunocompromised who cannot receive live vaccines. Another myth is that vaccines can contain microchips, enabling governments or others to track the whereabouts of an immunized person. This is actually impossible. Vaccines are produced in a restricted setting, and many vials actually contain multiple doses, and many people receive the doses from the same vial, so it's impossible to track one individual person.
So more than 1 billion children have been vaccinated in the last decade. Most children today receive life-saving vaccinations, and immunization currently prevents around 2 to 3 million deaths annually. 19.7 million children or people under the age of 1 years old have not been receiving any basic vaccines to begin with. So now let's look at a couple of diseases that vaccines have covered. So first we have Haemophilus influenza type B, which causes meningitis and pneumonia. So the current global coverage for this is with 3 doses of the HIV vaccine, and is estimated at around 72%. So this has helped to cover around 89% of Southeast Asia. Hepatitis B is a viral infection that affects the liver. So the Hep B vaccine for infants has been introduced nationwide and has a global coverage with 3 doses of the vaccine. And so that will be around 85%. And the global coverage at the moment is at 43%, and is as high as 84% in the WHO Western Pacific region. Then we have meningitis A, which is a bacterial infection that causes inflammation of the meninges in the spinal cord and brain. So it's often deadly and leaves about 1 in 5 affected individuals with long-term devastating sequelae. So that accounts for around 80 to 85% of meningitis epidemics in the African meningitis belt. So the meningitis A vaccine has covered around 350 million people in around 24 out of the 26 countries that have so far been vaccinated. We then have the rubella, which is a contagious viral infection that causes fever and rashes. So it's usually mild in children, but infection during early pregnancy can cause fetal death or congenital defects, such as the rubella syndrome, which leads to defects in the brain, the heart, the eyes, and the ears. So the rubella vaccine was introduced nationwide in around 173 member states by the end of 2019. And so far it's got a global coverage of 71%. So we then have the yellow fever, which is spread by mosquitoes and it causes high fever and jaundice. So as of 2019, the yellow fever vaccine had been introduced in routine infant immunization programs in around 36 of 40 countries that are at risk for yellow fever in Africa and the Americas. So the current coverage is at 46%. And lastly, we have the rotavirus, which causes watery diarrhea and vomiting and young children and infants. So this rotavirus vaccine was introduced in 108 countries by the end of 2019. So the current global coverage for this is at 39%. So overall, monitoring data at subnational levels is key to helping countries prioritize and to tailor their vaccination strategies and also to plan and address immunization gaps. Immunization and a development success story, and it saved millions of lives every single year and continues to do so. Our vaccines reduce the risk of getting diseases and it helps your body to build protection and have natural defense. So basically, when you get a vaccine, your immune system is going to respond and it's going to be stronger. So we now have vaccines to prevent more than 20 life-threatening illnesses, and it helps people of all ages live longer and healthier lives. Immunization currently prevents around 2 to 3 million deaths every year from diseases, and some of these diseases include tetanus, pertussis, influenza, and measles. However, despite the progress that we've made so far, too many people around the world have insufficient access to these vaccines. So in some countries, the progress in terms of vaccination has stopped or even reversed. Immunization is a key component of primary healthcare, and it's basically a human right. So to conclude, vaccines play a critical role in the prevention and control of infectious disease outbreaks.
Okay, so that was the end of our presentation. And I'm just going to invite Professor Karayiannis, who's also joined us now, to say a couple of words concerning the topic.
Me. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for allowing me to join you in this presentation. The topic you are covering is extremely important at the present time, with the effort that is being undertaken not just by Cyprus but all countries around the world to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. You covered most of the important things with regards to the safety of the vaccines and the rigors of testing before they are released, as well as how significant the contribution has been of vaccines in the last several decades in preventing major outbreaks of infectious diseases. When, of course, a new disease emerges, then it's difficult to control until a vaccine is produced. And I must say that the design and production of the COVID-19 vaccines has been extremely rapid because of the technology used, but this does not mean that they lack in safety. You also covered the issue of misinformation, which is circulating around social media, which is putting a lot of people off being vaccinated. I think it is extremely important to dispel whatever myths there are around the vaccine and encourage people to become vaccinated, because indeed it's the only way we can put a barrier against the transmission of the virus and then return to some sort of normality in our lives. So I'm not going to say anything more about the issue at this point, and I will jump in if there are questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Karayiannis. Now, I'm just going to read some of the questions that are on the side on the Q&A section. And if anyone has questions, feel free to put it up there and I'll just start reading them. So the first thing we have is, it says, I know you're not covering this, but in my country, there's primarily Sinopharm and Sinovac available. Anything you could tell us about those?
Is that question addressed to me?
It's to presenters and of course you too, Professor Karayiannis, if you want to answer.
I think as a rule, if the presenters then have a go and anything missing, I will complete.
Okay.
I think that was directed to me since I covered the vaccines. Unfortunately, I can't answer that question. As I previously stated, there are so many, not only awaiting clinical status, but also in clinical development. I think recently there's also the discussion of Johnson & Johnson introducing one, but also going back on their word and saying maybe it is going to have to be 2 doses. So unfortunately, in those two, I simply cannot comment, just as I simply cannot comment upon the Serum Institute of India, on Sputnik, and on the Sinovac variants, unfortunately.
Okay, perhaps I can shed some light there. As you know, the Sputnik vaccine is very similar to the AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. They use adenoviruses to carry the genetic information for the spike protein. And therefore, their efficacy is about the same. In fact, the Johnson & Johnson is slightly lower because it's a single dose. So most recent data suggests that with the AstraZeneca, the efficacy of the vaccine is around 85%, whilst that of the Moderna and Pfizer is around 94-95%. Of course, this is not bad when one considers what we get with flu, which ranges from 45% to 65%, because of the seasonal variants that circulate from year to year. Sometimes you have the vaccine and it does not protect you, and you end up being infected with a variant that the vaccine did not take into account. Now, as far as the vaccines that contain either inactivated whole virus or subunits of the virus, and Sinovac, I think, is one of them, there the efficacy is not as high as with the vaccines I mentioned before, is only around 60 to 65%. So the 4 vaccines that got licensed first at this stage appear to have the higher efficacy. And what we mean by that, ideally a vaccine should protect against infection. In other words, elicit neutralizing immunity. In the case of the COVID-19 vaccines, so far we know that they make symptoms much milder. Nobody needs to go into hospital if you have had the vaccine, and nobody will be intubated. Of course, the 5 to 12% of patients who do become infected from the trials, and we don't know whether the immunity there is not very good or not. Some of those, if they're in an elderly population and they have underlying conditions, then some of them may require hospitalization. Still, up to this point, we don't know whether we have sterilizing immunity with the COVID vaccines. But the clinical trials so far in the UK and Israel suggest that the case load has dropped, which is an indication that perhaps there is protection also.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. We'll just move on to the next question now as well. So it's asking, are there any vaccines that require only one dose? And I think the professor kind of answered that too, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which only requires the one dose.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, if the virus mutates again and again, will the vaccine we're taking be still valid, or will we then be required to take an upgraded version?
Not sure who that was directed at, but I'll take a guess at it. The point I tried to make across with the first two, which was the whole virus and the nucleic acid variants, is the fact that they are outdated in the sense that they are too targeted, too specific. And therefore, if we have a pathogen such as a virus like COVID-19, which unfortunately keeps mutating, it just can't adapt fast enough. But as far as I'm concerned, as far as the literature shows, the viral vector and protein subunit variants, new vaccines coming out, are actually very effective against these types of pathogens. But again, I'm no expert.
Okay. Thankfully, the technology is such that new variants can be introduced into new generation vaccines. In other words, have a similar situation to the seasonal flu vaccine. So at this point in time, I know Pfizer and Moderna are trialing out. They are updated vaccines which contain the South African and Brazilian strains. We know that the vaccines deal with the British variant, the B117 as it is known, so at least we don't have to worry about that one. But with the other two, there is only partial protection, and that is dependent on the level of the immune response that they elicit. So I foresee that by early autumn, everybody who's been vaccinated may have to take a booster immunization that will contain the variants. And let's hope that no other variants turn up in the meantime.
Okay. Now on to the next question, which says, the United States Centers for Disease Control has relaxed their guidance on mask wearing in public for fully vaccinated individuals this week. What are your thoughts on this? Anyone have any thoughts?
Any offers from the panel? Okay. We know, once again, we have Israel as a very good example, where nearly 60% of the population have been immunized, and they've relaxed everything, the distancing, the mask wearing, the gatherings, etc. And it's been, I think, 6-7 weeks since these relaxations, and there hasn't been an upsurge in cases. So I think that most countries will go that way if they achieve a high enough herd of immunity. I think relaxing this much earlier, it will not be good because we may see increases in transmission rates. The ECDC recently did, in fact, put out some recommendations, Amongst these, for immunized people include the fact that if you're a close contact of a case and you're immunized, you don't have to self-isolate. And you're also exempted from the rapid testing weekly. And I think these two we've already introduced in Cyprus too. For the rest, we have to wait.
Okay, so the next one says there was only one death in Cyprus. What was that referring to?
Sure. So as I've previously explained, my data isn't my own. I'm no expert, but I had a long talk with Dr. Georgios Tsiakalis, who's a HIV specialist, who's now in charge of part of the COVID response on Cyprus. And as far as he's concerned, the only death in Cyprus was from a 83-year-old male. Sorry, 83-year-old male, who presented with an extremely poor clinical picture to begin with, even before his COVID infection. And it was more, the discussion in the case was more to do with the fact that because he was already immunocompromised, the COVID just wreaked havoc upon his body, and unfortunately he died from it. So the point I was trying to make was the fact that graciously, this is not killing. This is more about an infection problem rather than it is about deaths in Cyprus, which is very good. Because if we compare to, say, India, which at the moment is having egregious numbers of deaths, or even Brazil, this is a much better clinical picture, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Now we have another question that asks, why would one take other vaccines if the mRNA vaccines are the most effective?
Because before I say anything, would anybody like to comment on that? Okay, there's not enough of them. If we want to vaccinate people quickly, then we need to use anything we have at our disposal. The thing that worries me most is incomplete vaccinations and poor vaccination rates in countries with high transmission rates. Because in that sort of milieu, the danger of the virus changing is increased. Okay, if you have high replication rates, high transmission rates, poor vaccination rates, then that's a recipe for not disaster, but for problems. So not only do we need to start vaccinating, but we need to make vaccines available to all countries around the world, particularly the poorer countries which cannot afford to buy them.
Okay. The next one we have here is, are vaccine passports a good idea? Do we have? Oh, Professor Karayiannis, would you like to answer this one too?
Okay, well, it's something that the European Union is talking about. A lot of people are against it because they regard it as a discriminating weapon or medium. I think that in the end, the European Union may adopt it because it will make travel easier. It's just a question of whether the governments will accept it, and if the governments will accept it, then people may eventually get to accept it too. I think it will be an incentive for people to get immunized, although some people may regard it as a threat or pushing them to against their will to be vaccinated.
Okay, now we have another question which asks, if I take a different vaccine from the ones that's being mentioned in the presentation, will it be accepted in Cyprus? For example, if I come in summer, or will every country accept only the vaccines that it provides and acknowledges?
No, already the Minister of Health the other day mentioned Sputnik also as an acceptable vaccine, even though it has not been licensed by the European Union yet. So basically, if you have evidence that you have received a COVID-19 vaccine and is amongst the ones that are known and they are past the phase 3 trials, then fine.
Okay, now we have, so for the take-home message, how do vaccines bring us closer besides helping us live without the fear of infections? This is for the presenters, I think, mostly.
I'll take a crack at it. I think the take-home message is very simple. This is a global event which has affected every single one of us, personally, generally, socially, in every aspect we can think of. And we need to, simply put, tackle this all together, doing our parts. Can be something as simple as wearing a mask, can be something as simple as, declining to go to a party or something similar, but each little thing we do will in fact slow this down. And we have seen the results of early relaxation. We have seen the results of people who are not complying with the rules. And this has simply all, a year ago now, we all thought that this was just going to be another little outbreak and it would disappear. And clearly it hasn't. So that's why.
I think if I can add something there, most people thought, particularly with the example of Cyprus, we did well in the first wave, and they thought that we will be able to ride subsequent waves as well as the first wave. What we didn't sort of bargain for is the fact that people became both mentally and physically tired of the restriction measures, to the extent that they were not applying them anymore. And on top of this, having a variant like the British variant, which is transmitted at least 50 times more effectively, which infects younger people, causing severe symptomatology in many cases that needs hospitalization. All these we didn't bargain for, and that's why we reached up to nearly 1,000 cases a day quite recently, which was very worrying because it really stressed the intensive care units.
The next question we have here is there any chance that as the virus mutates, it can become more severe / deadly or present other new symptoms that have not appeared previously?
I think I will answer unless somebody wants to have a crack. No. The matter of fact is that from the appearance of the virus in the Far East, as it passed through continent to continent and over time, we saw symptoms that were not reported in the first wave in the Far East. For example, the loss of taste and loss of smell was not apparent at the beginning. The thrombosis cases that seem to occur in COVID patients were not apparent at the beginning. The fact that you may have neurological involvement were not apparent at the beginning. So yes, there is a possibility that as the virus mutates, it may either become more pathogenic and cause more problems, or more likely, as it has happened with so many other diseases, it may adapt to the human population to the extent that it does no longer kill, but that will take time, possibly years to occur. So until then, All we have to do is get immunized.
Okay, so Victoria here asks, given recent increased concerns over blood clotting with the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines, do you think there will be increased regulation around who is able to take these vaccines, even with the push to reach high rates of vaccine/herd immunity? For example, populations with clotting disorders or people taking medications that increase clot risk.
Yes. These issues with the AstraZeneca vaccine, when they surfaced, firstly, they said the vaccine should not be given to the over 55s because none of them, no such patients were included in the phase 3 trials. We were one of the few countries in Europe who recommended that we should continue, and we continued. Following these thrombotic episodes, which incidentally occur at a frequency of, in the United Kingdom, out of 17 million immunizations, there were 17 cases of thrombi, I think 6 of 7 of which were fatal. And in the United States, with the Johnson & Johnson, they had 7.5 million and about 4 or 5 thrombotic episodes that led to death. So we are talking about an extremely rare occurrence, which led the United Kingdom recently to suggest that the vaccine should not be given to younger people below 30 years of age. But the evidence for that is not solid, and we will have to wait and see with experience where there will be any contraindications.
Okay, now we have a question, and it's saying, I'm not quite sure if you understood my question. In general, how do vaccines, not COVID specific, actually bring us closer together, as the title of the presentation implies?
Well, I mean, they allow us to sort of live without these the threat of epidemics or pandemics. When I talk about immunizations, I usually have a slide which shows the disease burden in the early 90s and the disease burden from infectious diseases in the early 2000s. And it's incredible the impact of vaccination on survival and more or less the elimination to near extinction of some of the diseases. The best example we have, which was mentioned in the presentation, is smallpox. Through universal vaccination around the world, we managed to make the disease disappear. And that was possible only because humans were the only hosts. There were no animal reservoirs. With some of these diseases, like the coronaviruses, the known ones at least, we know that there are animals where they can hide and reemerge. We don't know yet whether COVID-19 will find an animal to use as an intermediate host in the near future, but we have to be on the lookout. So without helping each other, then humanity will not be where it is today.
Okay, the next one we have here asks, when people get vaccinated, if they get infected with a new mutation of the virus, are they going to have less severe symptoms, or will the symptoms and their severity be the same as if not having done the vaccine at all?
I think I will take that. The information so far is that there may be some cross-reactivity that will ameliorate the symptoms, but we don't have much information yet in countries where, for example, the Brazilian strain is dominant and the South African strain is dominant, to see what the impact is on symptomatology and vaccination, because the vaccination programs have not progressed as much as in other countries. We cannot test this in the lab, in other words. What we can in the lab do is test for neutralizing activity of existing antibodies, but as far as symptoms are concerned, we don't know.
Okay, we now have, you mentioned concerns about vaccinating people at risk for blood clots. What is the most recent guidance on pregnant and breastfeeding women?
Right. In the UK, the recommendation is that pregnant women should not be vaccinated with AstraZeneca. But if you've already been vaccinated with any of the vaccines, then that shouldn't stop you from breastfeeding. We know that the babies receive antibody protection through the milk from the mother. So the babies are not in danger, in any danger. On the contrary, they will be protected if the mother is vaccinated.
So we don't have any more questions. So I think maybe it's time to kind of wrap everything up. Yeah, okay, nothing's coming up. So I just want to thank all the presenters who, spent their time and made this presentation, which was great. And also thank you so much for Professor Karayiannis for sitting here and answering all the questions as well and providing all the info that you can. And also thank you to everyone who came and joined and listened. And I hope you got some sort of information out of this and it was helpful.
Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.